Hey everyone, and welcome back to Citywide Blackout, your home for the best creators from around the world. My name's Max, I'm your host, and today, folks, we're taking a little bit of a journey here. We are heading up to Mount Kilimanjaro to speak to my next guest. His name is David Sklar. He has a recently released book, Moonstone Hero, which I gotta say is one of the coolest titles I've heard in quite some time. David, welcome to the show. It is great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be there.
All right. Now, this book is, as I have read, is partially based on a true story. I think first thing I got to ask is how much of it's true?
A fair amount of it is actually true. So I did actually climb Mount Kilimanjaro in the 1970s, and I was a medical student at that time. And there was one of the people in our party who became very ill up near the top of the mountain and had a high altitude pulmonary edema. And so I was involved in carrying him down and experienced some of the things that our main character, who's named Andrew, experiences in the book. So that part is relatively true. Now, of course, you know, some of the dialogue and some of the other characters who are in the book are a little bit altered from what actually happened, but much of at least the early part of the book is relatively true and based on actual experience.
Wow. Well, so for the folks at home who did not go to medical school, could you, layman's terms, what this person suffered from?
Yeah. So when you climb a high mountain, sometimes some people, and it's unclear why, develop fluid that accumulates in your lungs. And that fluid really doesn't have anything to do with your heart failing the way it does, for example, when older people develop heart failure. They also get fluid, but this fluid goes in, and it probably has something to do with the low oxygen level as you get higher and higher. Some people have that reaction. Other people have more minor mountain sickness, headache, and nausea. And I actually experienced that part of it. I did get a headache and did have some nausea. But others will develop this fluid that accumulates and essentially suffocates you. You can't get enough oxygen into your brain. Some people also get swelling of the brain and they can die from that. But high altitude pulmonary edema is very serious, and people die from it if you can't get them oxygen or can't get them off the mountain down to a lower altitude.
Jeez, and this really happened. You were climbing the mountain. You were with a group, and one of them suffered from this.
Yes, this really happened. And the real story that this is based on, one of the people who was an American Peace Corps volunteer, and he came very short of breath as we were climbing. And although I was a second-year medical student, I had never seen an actual case of pulmonary edema, although I had read about it. And I was, to that extent, somewhat prepared for someone getting it, at least being able to diagnose it. But unfortunately, the treatment is oxygen and getting people off the mountain. We had no oxygen. I guess I had hoped that the guides and people who were climbing with us would have some medical capability to do something if that happened. But as it turned out, this all really accelerated in the middle of the night at the top of the mountain when it was very cold and it was 15,000 feet. And so then we had to make a decision. What do we do? Do we try to carry this guy down? Do we try to wait till morning? And it became increasingly clear as the night became deeper and deeper into the middle of the night that he wasn't going to probably make it. Now, at that same time, a lot of the party was preparing themselves to try to ascend to the peak, because that was the plan was to actually get to the very top of the mountain just at sunrise. And so typically what will happen is people will leave this last hut, which was at 15,000 feet, to get to 19,000, where you're at the very top. And then in theory, the clouds and so on will break up and you'll be able to see for 100 miles and the sun will be shining and so on. It doesn't always happen that way. And at that time, it was, weather wasn't good. There was snow and wind and cold, and it was very threatening. But that was what some of the people in the party who had really come from all over the world, they come from Germany and Australia and England and Denmark and so on. And they had come to achieve this sort of personal goal. And suddenly, when this person was becoming ill and we really needed people to help get him down, they had to deal with this conflict of what do they do, and trying to carry him down would be risky too, because they could die in the process of trying to carry him down. Now, it turns out with Mount Kilimanjaro, there's a one peak and then there's a lower peak, which you have to then get over to go along this sort of thing that's called a saddle to get to the higher peak. And so that it's not trivial to kind of get someone down, because if they're having trouble breathing just without even walking, the more of their walking that they do, the more difficult it's going to be for them to actually get down to the lower hut, which is at about 12,000 feet.
Wow, geez, that's and this all happened. So I'd like to talk about where you had to, I guess, where you sort of like filled in the blanks for the story. Like what were some of the parts of this just that didn't happen?
Well, so the part that I've told you did happen as far as actually carrying him down. Some of the conversation that occurred during the process of trying to carry him down, or trying to, initially we didn't think we were going to carry him down. I think the hope was that he would be able to walk, and that as we walked, he would be able to slowly make it over the lower peak, and we wouldn't actually have to carry him, because carrying someone at 16 or 17,000 feet is almost impossible. But so unfortunately, that did happen. He got to a point where he just couldn't walk and he wanted to give up. He wanted to let us leave him there. And, he was cold and he was numb in his feet. And so that part happened. The conversation that we had about, do we leave you here? What do we do? I think some of that was reconstructed. I'm not sure it actually happened exactly as I wrote it, partly just because I'm not sure how much I actually remembered of, the word for word, but there were definitely some very awkward conversations, and there were some issues related to the relationship between him and his girlfriend and myself that were probably a little bit exaggerated in the story, because in the story there is a romance that is sort of like a triangle that occurs, and it's sort of part of the story. And I will say that was probably a bit exaggerated, although not that much.
Wow. Okay. What made you want to write this in the first place? I mean, you have published other books in the past, and of course have
Yes.
many medical articles. But why do this?
Well, so what really inspired me to do this was COVID, actually, and COVID really forced a lot of us in medicine, and I'm still practicing as an emergency physician, by the way, but it really forced a lot of us to confront our own potential risk and mortality going into hospitals and taking care of COVID patients. And particularly at the beginning, when there wasn't really any vaccination, and even the protective equipment was really inadequate. And so when we walked into the emergency department or the critical care part of the hospital, we were really putting our own lives at risk, the nurses, the doctors. And so we had to make that decision. And I do remember for myself, the first month or two after COVID arrived at the US, that my wife was very resistant to my going in, because I'm a little older now and I was in a high risk group. And she was, well, they're younger people. Why don't you just let them take the risk? They're probably not going to die the way you will if you get this. And so I would say for the first month or two after COVID arrived, I went along with her desires for me not to work in the emergency department. But then after about a month or two, I realized this thing isn't going away. And I kind of felt like I needed to be there with them and to kind of demonstrate that I was willing to put my life at risk just like they were. And I started thinking about what experiences have I had in my life that were comparable? And this experience on Mount Kilimanjaro kind of came back to me thinking, well, that was probably the closest I ever came to doing something that where I could have died. And I realized, okay, well, all these other people are now doing this. And why is that? Are we all like superheroes, or are we just doing our job? Or what is it that kind of gets us to kind of walk in day after day? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, maybe it's just that we're just seeing this as part of, what's expected, what we're supposed to do, and part of being a good citizen in a sense. And we aren't really, any different from anybody else, but we're just willing to get in there and do what we think is our responsibility. And maybe that's part of what heroism really is. It's not people being it's not like we're being Superman or Batman or Robin or anything like that. We're just doing things that we're asked to do. We're in a difficult situation, but people sometimes are called upon to do those kinds of things. So that was sort of the inspiration for writing this book, was to just say, we can all be heroes, and we can create a culture in a way of helping each other when the situation calls for it. And we can all be heroes, because that was sort of what I saw with COVID, that we weren't necessarily any different from anybody else, but we were just willing to kind of do what we felt like we needed to do. And that was what a lot of us were going to be called upon, not just the doctors and nurses, but the people who were bringing food to people and doing all kinds of other things that allowed us all to make it through the worst parts of COVID.
I like that. So let's dive into the writing process. As you mentioned, largely this all happened. This is largely a true story.
Yeah.
Where did you begin?
Well, so as far as the writing process goes, I've always felt like stories are important, and stories of patients and stories of our relationship with patients. So I have told stories to my children growing up, and I've told stories to my grandchildren, and I've written stories as part of my editorials so I've been an editor of a journal called Academic Medicine. And I've always felt like stories were part of how we kind of convey important messages to our audiences. And sometimes the best way to do that is to begin with a story. And so that was sort of how this occurred. I just started telling the story rather than to talk to people about heroism or courage or anything like that. I thought, all right, I'll just start telling the story and kind of see where it goes. And bit by bit, it almost sort of wrote itself. And that's sort of how I found a lot of stories go, is you sort of go down a road thinking you know where it's leading, and then it sort of starts taking some left turns and right turns, and it starts taking you in unexpected directions. And that was sort of how this was. I started with telling the story about what was happening in the mountain, and the next thing I knew, we were really having these other side stories of what was that conversation at the top of the mountain, and then what happened to the people after the most critical part of the rescue occurred. What was their relationship like? What were some of the consequences of actually having a relationship where you save someone's life? Do you continue to have a relationship? And what does that person feel like they owe you? What do you owe them? And what would that relationship be like? And then what if there's this complicating factor, as in this story, where the person who's involved in saving the other person falls in love with his girlfriend? Now what? Where do you go? Do you do you kind of allow that to happen? Do you not allow that? And where do you go with that? How does that complicate the relationship, which is a very close one when you're, again, carrying someone over a mountain? You're very close as two people's bodies are very intertwined. Well, where does that lead you when there's this other conflicting desire that may not be acceptable, may actually be a sign of betrayal of the trust between the two people? How do you struggle with that? How do you overcome that?
What would you say was the hardest part to write, especially given that so much of this is so personal to you?
Oh, I think probably the sex. Yeah.
Fair.
Because there is some sex in the book, and it's kind of awkward to write about it. I mean, I'm a grandfather. I'm a doctor, and how do you write about things like that in a way that is respectful and also realistic, and that is conveys the meaning of the relationship, and do it in a way that's not gross or taking advantage of some of the less, what would I say, less seemly aspects of a book like this, because really I wanted the book to really get at important questions and issues around courage and heroism, and then even some of the things like betrayal and some of the complicating factors. So how do you write about sex when you're also trying to write about what at least I felt were important big issues that are sort of connected to where we are in our lives right now in the United States, where I think all of us may be called upon to take steps to do things that might put us at risk in different ways, particularly some of the politics that are going on. So that was probably the most difficult part for me, was writing about that and doing it in a way that I thought was respectful, but also didn't do something that would drive me away from some of these bigger issues.
I find it interesting that sex is the thing that kind of that was like the hurdle for you, especially as you mentioned, you're a grandfather, you're a doctor. This should all be familiar for you, but it's like this was kind of the thing that kind of tripped you up a little bit.
Well, it's hard because I think we, as particularly as doctors, it's not like we don't hear about people's sexual issues when they come. Particularly for me as an emergency physician, there's probably hardly anything that I haven't seen or heard, and a lot of these things could be quite embarrassing. So it's not like the issues around sex are impossible to imagine or to talk about. But I think, again, relationships, particularly relationships between people, life and death relationships, are serious, and they're serious issues, and even issues related to putting your own life at risk are also very serious. And I didn't really want the sex to kind of draw away from those serious issues. On the other hand, I think that there are, sex and other kinds of conflicts, whether it's money or whether it's other kinds of benefits that people can get in doing things, can kind of drive you away from some of these really serious conversations about maybe doing things that are going to put your career or your life at risk. And I didn't want that to happen. So I was trying to find the balance. How do you find the balance of discussing a potential relationship with the woman who is involved with one of the people that you've rescued, and how do you talk about that in a way that doesn't take away from these other very serious conversations?
Mm-hmm. Now, as I mentioned before, you are no stranger to writing. You have published over 200 articles about medical education, emergency health, and global health. You've also published two books, La Clinica, which is a memoir of your experience as a volunteer in a rural Mexican clinic, and Atlas of Men, great title by the way, which is an award-winning novel about a secret research project. What would you say was the real newness of writing Moonstone Hero?
Well, so those other two books were about, I would say, very different topics. So one of them is the first one is a memoir, and it's a memoir about my work in Mexico before I became a doctor. And I would say the main focus of that is the story of people and the challenge of being an untrained person who goes to a little clinic expecting that they're just going to be an aide to a doctor working in this clinic, and finding out, whoops, you're actually going to be doing a lot more than you ever imagined. And this person who you went to help isn't actually really a doctor. And this little clinic, you're going to actually be left on your own to try to do what you can for the people who don't have any other access to healthcare. What do you do? Do you just kind of do the best you can? Do you, do you just leave? What's the right thing to do? And it really got me thinking a lot about Americans who go to other places and, try to care for people in those settings, hoping that they're going to do something useful, but potentially maybe causing some harm in the process, because now they're going to a place that may already have some modicum of medical care. Are you going to go in and hurt what already exists? Are you going to do something that disrupts the healthcare system? So it raises some questions about Americans and aid and going to those villages. That was what that book was about. And I think some very serious questions, because there are a lot of people who go and do global health, and it's really important, but it doesn't always go in the way that they think, and there are some unintended consequences. Atlas of Men was a book that I wrote also based on some real things that happened. So I was a student at a school that during my second or third week there asked all of us to take off all of our clothes, and we were then photographed naked, and we didn't know why. And then the question was, what was that all about? And it turned out that this was part of a research project, as I found from conversations with the doctor who was in charge, in which there was a theory that you could predict people's future leadership and capabilities based on their body type. It was an old theory of eugenics, where you could actually classify people based on whether they were what's called an endomorph, a mesomorph, or an ectomorph. So these various body types, and that those body types are associated with personality types. Well, so that would mean that, again, if you were a mesomorph, you would be kind of more of a leader. If you were more of a ectomorph, kind of tall, thin, you would be a nervous type. And then if you were an endomorph, you would be kind of this jolly, funny kind of guy, a little overweight, make jokes and things like that. A lot of stereotypes there. But there was a book called Atlas of Men that a guy named Sheldon wrote that classified people in this way. And they did this kind of photography to me and to my classmates at Phillips Exeter Academy, which is where that book was based on. And they also did it at a bunch of colleges. They did it, I think, at Princeton and Yale and a bunch of colleges. And that was done with 18-year-olds. And it was actually an expose in the New York Times that published this. So that book was sort of an exploration of some of the thinking that existed during the time of the 50s and 60s and 70s. In fact, this particular book was based upon pictures that were taken of me. This was early 1960s. So, this was still going on. Actually, it went on at Exeter until about 1971 or 72, when they finally got girls there, and the girls rebelled and wouldn't let them take those pictures, which is interesting. That's what that book was about. Alice of Men, was exploring a different thing. I was really concerned about the whole issue of are we willing to do the things that it's going to take to save each other from this pandemic, and how do we get people to do that? And my the revelation that in fact people were willing to do that, and they were willing to do it because it was sort of what they were trained to do. And if we just gave them enough recognition and sort of support to do those things, that they were going to come along and they were going to do these very courageous things and put their lives at risk. And that was quite amazing to me that would happen. And that maybe if we could just encourage a culture where we were looking out for each other, and if someone was in danger, that we were willing to help them, maybe we could, accomplish other things, because I could see other dangers coming down the road, like, global climate change and things that, other challenges that we were going to have to face as a society. They were going to be hard. And maybe this pandemic and the courage that people showed in addressing it might be able to teach us something about how to address some of these other problems. So that was a little different inspiration. That's what I wrote it for. And then, of course, the story sort of started going in other directions from what I had planned. I mean, I didn't plan it to go exactly the way it went, but it just went that way. And so I sort of followed that.
All right. I want to ask about the medical student in this book. Obviously, that's you. But would you say these two characters are very distinct, yourself and the student?
Well, so the medical student in the book is somewhat different from me. So in the book, this medical student is a little bit more, what would I say, compulsive, has also some issues related to alcohol. So I would say that I kind of modeled the medical student on some other people that I knew who were a little bit different from me. Same thing of some of the other characters in the book. So yes, there was this person who had the pulmonary edema. He wasn't exactly like the character in the book. And the same thing with the woman who was in the book. There was certainly a love interest in the actual climb, but the woman that is in the book is a little bit different. So yeah, the book in the book, the doctor becomes a critical care pulmonary doctor. I'm an emergency physician. So those are different specialties, a little related, but somewhat different.
Have you been able to reach out to other folks who were with you on this original climb?
Well, so the reality is that I did actually run into the person who I saved. And so that part at the very end did occur. And it did kind of happen sort of as described at the Beta Breakers race, which is kind of amazing in a thing, as an example of an unlikely event to occur. So yeah, and in a way, some of the awkwardness that occurs in the book did actually happen when I did run into this particular person, and it was sort of part of as I wrote the book, part of my reflection of the fact that I think when you are involved in actually personally saving someone's life, and there's so much, when you think about how much they feel that they owe you, there's never going to be a way to totally repay that, because it's just too great a burden. And in fact, no one should ever feel like they should pay that back. And there are other examples in my life where I've been involved in saving someone's life. I've gone to see them, and most of the time they don't even remember that I was involved with that, because they're so sick, often semi-comatose, that they don't remember it. And I don't think we should ever expect anybody to feel like they owe you anything. That's part of our job, and we shouldn't be feeling that this, because it really is too big a burden, frankly. I feel grateful when I can have, the opportunity, the privilege to actually be involved in saving someone's life. Sometimes it's a heart attack. It can be someone with a ruptured aorta. I mean, there are different kinds of life-threatening crises that happen to people. In my own life, it's probably happened 20 or 30 times where I've been involved in, someone who was actively dying in front of me, and I was able to do something, and it really changed the trajectory. And, there have been opportunities for me to go back and see them and have a conversation. And I don't feel like, I ever want anybody to feel like, hey, you owe me for this. That's just not appropriate. But I feel very fortunate to be able to do that. It kind of gives meaning to my life. And I think those of us in emergency medicine or critical care or surgery, we're very privileged to be able to do that, I think, But in the book, it was a little bit different because I was really putting my own life at risk and trying to carry someone over a mountain in the middle of the night in the cold. And I almost did die. I really did feel like we were potentially all going to die. And that's a little bit different. And I think COVID was a little bit different too, because I think we were all who went in, particularly early on, we were really putting our lives at risk in a way very different from what usually happens in the emergency department or a critical care unit. And I think, there's really something to learn from that.
Absolutely. What do you think you learned from this?
Well, I'm still learning. I mean, I'm still thinking about that. I think one thing I learned was that I was really grateful to be able to be there with my residents. So where I was working, the emergency department where I work was in Phoenix, and we have an emergency medicine residency. And one of the things I learned was how much I was grateful for our younger generation and how amazing they are. And the fact that they didn't hesitate to go in and do things that could have killed them. And I guess I've always felt like it was wonderful to be side by side with the medical students and the residents, but they were incredible, and they are incredible people. And I just think we're very fortunate that this younger generation is coming along, and I feel like maybe they'll save us for the future. So that's what I learned, is that we're very fortunate for this younger generation, who they are. I don't know how they got to be how they are, but they're wonderful. And being able to be side by side with them and share that experience, that was really wonderful to be able to experience that and learn that together.
Okay. Is there another book in the works?
I think so. I don't want to talk about it yet, but I think there's more that I want to write about. I mean, there's a lot of issues around health and healthcare that I think we really need to be grappling with for the future. I also think that there's a lot of challenges coming down the road for all of us in terms of how we are going to have to be called upon to make some sacrifices. And I think my generation is going to have to do that. I don't think we're going to be able to just retire and go and play golf. I think that a lot of the people in my generation, we were sort of hippies, and we were radicals, and we were politically engaged in different ways. And though a lot of people now are older, and some of them have medical problems, and they're not quite as robust as they once were, they also have money, and they have power, and I think they have the opportunity to make a difference. And so I guess probably the next book in some way is going to grapple with some of that, and hopefully provide at least some characters that are actually going to go out and do some of that, and maybe help us see the way that we could contribute to to create a future for these wonderful people who are coming along and who are so brave during COVID. I think we have a responsibility to that generation, and I think we need to figure out do that effectively. So that's probably what I want to write about.
And you know what? I cannot wait to read it. Well, David, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate this. For the folks at home, you go to davidpsklar.com for more information, and certainly get the books, leave reviews. We keep talking about it. I'll keep talking about it, but this is always key for that interaction and just bringing everything up. And David, thanks again. Appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was nice meeting you, Max.
All right.
Hey, this is singer-songwriter and mental health advocate Stephanie Mathias. Be sure to check out my single Hero side, available on all platforms now, and listen to Citywide Blackout, your home for the best indie artists.
Phew, what a journey today, huh? Well, that brings this episode to a close. You can follow the show on Facebook under Citywide Blackout, and Twitter and Instagram under Citywide Max. Get at me at citywidemax@yahoo.com, and check the show out wherever you find your favorite podcast, as well as every Saturday at 10 p.m. on Boston Free Radio. That's all for now, and I'll see you next time.